Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here, and this is my revised Blizzard build, and the final one for Season 3, as it'll be ending in a week. As usual, it kills bosses and tier 100s alike, and does the other things too. If you enjoy these guides or find them informative, please give a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It helps out the channel a lot, and I'd really like it to grow. Thanks for that, and now let's get to the build. For the skill tree, we're going to start with our Firebolt. We're going to take 2 points in there. We're going to come down to our core skills, take 1 into Potent Warding, 1 into Frozen Orb, and go for the Greater Frozen Orb. Then in our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 5 into Teleport to go for Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, going for Mystical Ice Armor, 5 into Frost Nova to go for Mystical Frost Nova. Then we come down to our Conjuration skills. We're going to get 1 into Align the Elements to get the 3 in Mana Shield and 3 in Protection. Then in our Mastery skills, we're taking 1 in Blizzard, of course, to go for Mage's Blizzard. Then we're also going to grab 1 into Inner Flames to put 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then down in our ultimate skills, we're going to make sure we get our Deep Freeze. And then we're going to put 3 points into everything above Permafrost, including Permafrost. So 3 here, 3 into Hoarfrost, 3 into Frigid Breeze, and 3 into Icy Touch. Then we come down here to our key passives, and we're going to take Shatter. So for the Paragon board, in our first board we're putting in Flame Feeder. That's going to give us damage to burning enemies, as well as increased direct damage to burning enemies. In our second board, we're going for the Icefall board, and we're going to put in the Unleash Glyph here. So after spending 50 mana, we deal 7% increased damage, and gain 7% increased mana regen for 3 seconds. For our third board, we're going for the Enchantment Master board, and we're putting in the Elementalist Glyph here, so dealing Fire, Cold or Lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our fourth board, we're going for the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph for the extra critical strike damage, and crits will also increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Then we're going to come back down here to our second board and go left. For our fifth board, the Frigid Fate board, making sure we take this awesome legendary node, and putting in the Stalagmite Glyph. That's going to give us increased Ice Spike skill damage, which is very important for the build, and also our Ice Spikes will gain 20% critical strike chance. Then we come back up to our Burning Instinct board and go left from there to get our sixth board, Ceaseless Conduit. We're going to put the Control Glyph in here for the extra damage to CC'd enemies. We also deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And lastly, our seventh board, we're going to put in the Enchanter Glyph, and that's going to give us basically just loads of non-physical damage, and this is going to be the Static Surge board. All of this is going to be in the build planner in the description below, and that's also going to include all the gear, Seneschal construct, enchantments, skill tree, etc. So make sure to check that out to go through at your own pace. So for the enchantments, our first enchantment is going to be the Frozen Orb enchantment. Whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And the explosion from this has a 30% chance to make all enemies hit vulnerable for 2 seconds. And if they're already frozen, Frozen Orb will always make them vulnerable. Our second enchantment is going to be the Firebolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies additional burning damage. This is what we use to proc our Flame Feeder Glyph, as well as getting the bonuses out of our Devouring Blaze. Next up we have the Seneschal construct. So for our Governing Stones, we're going to be using the Tempest Governing Stone, and we're going to put in the Breaking support, Efficiency support, and Arcing support into this. If you're having mana issues, then you would use resource support in place of efficiency support. For our second governing stone, we're going to be using Flash of Adrenaline, and we're going to want tactical support, duration support, and initiative support. If you do happen to have the unique tuning stones, like Evernight and Genesis, you would replace efficiency support with Evernight, and you would replace initiative support with Genesis. So for the gear, I'll list on the left the affixes you want from best to worst. And let's start with the helm. So we're going to be looking for a helm with total armor percent, cooldown reduction, max life, and intelligence. If you can't get those, look for all stats or crowd control duration. And for the aspect, we're going to be using Snowguards. So while within your own blizzard and for 3 seconds after, you take 20 to 25% less damage. Now, if you happen to have a Harlequin crest, then you would use that here instead. And if you want an extra damage boost for fighting bosses, you would use a Godslayer crown for the built-in damage, and also the unique aspect. Next up, for the chest piece, we're going to be using a defensive chest piece, so something with total armor percent, damage reduction against burning, damage reduction from close or distant. If you can't get those, then look for something with intelligence or damage percent. As for the aspect, you're going to be looking for the aspect of Disobedience here. This is a must-have. As you can see, you gain 0.6 to 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 36 to 66% depending on your roll. So that's a huge armor boost. As for the gloves, we're going to be looking for something with crit chance, attack speed, lucky hit percent, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then look for crit chance against injured, or all stats. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Conceited here, so you deal 15 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. Next up we have the pants. We're looking for Tybalt's Will, as it gives you a huge damage boost, as well as some maximum resource and some damage reduction from close enemies. But also, you gain 20 to 40% increased damage whilst unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. And when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource. Definitely want to get your hands on this as soon as you can. If you don't happen to have Tybalt's Will, you would use something just like the chest piece, with total armor percent, damage reduction from burning, and damage reduction against close or distant. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction against injured. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like Everliving here, so you take 20 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the boots. We're going to look for Esu's Heirloom here. That's going to give you a good amount of movement speed after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and some mana cost reduction, so 4 good stats there. And as for the unique aspect, your critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of your movement speed bonus. So this gives you actually quite a lot of critical strike chance. And if you don't have access to Esu's Heirloom, you would use boots with movement speed percent, ranks into teleport, intelligence, and ranks into Frost Nova. If you can't get those, look for all stats or mana cost reduction. As for the aspect, you would want to use Ghostwalkers, so whilst unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and you can move freely through enemies. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to be looking for intelligence, all stats, critical strike damage, and damage to vulnerable. If you can't get that, then look for damage to close, damage to burning, or damage to chilled enemies. I am using a dagger here for the extra damage to close enemies. And of course you're going to want to look for the highest item power possible for the highest damage per second. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Swell here, so we deal 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up we have the offhand, and we're going to be looking for critical strike chance, cooldown reduction, resource generation, and mana cost reduction. If you can't get those, then look for intelligence, damage reduction from burning enemies, all stats, or lucky hit percent. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of the Frozen Tundra. So while Deep Freeze is active, exploding ice spikes form in the area, doing some cold damage, but also our ice spikes have a 50% increased explosion radius, which is the main thing we want out of this aspect. Next up we have the Amulet, and we're going to be looking for total armor percent, ranks into Devouring Blaze or Hoarfrost, mana cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. If you can't get those, then look for movement speed percent, or any of the damage reductions, like normal damage reduction, or against close, distant, or burning. As for the aspect, we'll be using the Glacial aspect, so when we cast Blizzard, it will periodically spawn exploding ice spikes that deal a good amount of damage. Also, your ice spikes deal 23% increased damage multiplicative to frozen enemies. So this aspect is really important, it's a big chunk of our damage, so you want to look for the highest number possible, so a 925 item powered item with a max roll will get you the best result. Next up we have the rings. I'm going to be using a Ring of Starless Skies. It is an uber unique, but I will talk about the alternatives after as usual. So this will give you critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, and lucky hit chance. Core skill damage isn't really too useful as it's only benefiting our frozen orb, but the unique aspect is really good. Spending our primary resource reduces the resource cost of our skills and increases our damage by 10% for 3 seconds, and that will stack up to 40% and keep on refreshing when you cast skills. And our other ring, we're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us a lot of non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. And as for the awesome unique aspect, for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, depending on your roll, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all of these bonuses. So those are the best 2 rings, but alternatively, if you don't have a Ring of Starless Skies, as it's pretty hard to get, being an uber, then you would use a Blue Rose. So this will give you critical strike damage, a lot of ice spike damage, lucky hit chance, and mana cost reduction. But also on lucky hit, damaging an enemy has a 30% chance to form an exploding ice spike, dealing cold damage, and that chance is tripled if the enemy is frozen. Alternatively, if you don't have any uniques, then you would want to use a ring with critical strike chance, resource generation, crit damage, and damage to vulnerable. If you can't get those, then look for damage to close, or damage to burning / chilled. And as for the aspects, you would want to look for the Prodigy's aspect, so using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana, or the aspect of the Umbral, which will restore 1 to 4 of your primary resource when you CC an enemy. Both of these things will keep your mana at basically full the whole time. If your mana issues are not really an issue, then you don't have to use both of these, and you could change one of them out for either the aspect of Control to deal 25 to 35% more damage to stunned, immobilized, or frozen enemies, or Edgemasters aspect to deal 10 to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. That pretty much wraps up all of the gear. For the gems, I'll be using the skulls in the jewellery, the green gems, emeralds, in the weapon and offhand, and the red gems in the armour. That's the end of the guide / build, so thanks a lot for watching. If you made it this far, leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out so much. Thanks again, and hope to see you in the next video. Bye!